Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Picture this. You are a space marine. You have survived everything the galaxy could possibly throw at you. Alien horde after alien horde, traitor legions, demonic incursions, the creeping horror of the void, and the deeper horror of what lives within it. You have done this for decades, maybe centuries, your body performing feats of strength and endurance that would shatter any normal human being entirely. You are, by every measure, one of the most formidable warriors in the known universe. And then, on some forgotten battlefield, on some world whose name will fade from the records before the century is out, something goes wrong. Maybe it is a blade that finds the gap between your backpack housing and your gorget. Maybe it is a siege round that detonates at point-blank range, which is turning your torso into a ruin of shattered ceramite and ruptured organs. Maybe it is a clawed limb the size of a girder, belonging to something ancient and alien, that closes around your midsection and squeezes until the sound of your own spine breaking is the loudest thing you have ever heard. Maybe it is a Chaos Marine driving a power axe through your chest at such an angle that the damage touches things that no amount of transhuman biology can repair. Maybe it is a fall from height, a catastrophic structural collapse, a detonation point blank, a dozen other varieties of catastrophe that the 41st Millennium produces, with remarkable creativity and absolute indifference to the value of the person caught in the middle of it. The specifics vary, the result does not. You are dying. Your twin hearts stutter. Your enhanced blood was that extraordinary gene-engineered coagulant that can seal wounds that would leave a normal human exsanguinated in seconds. Fights furiously, but the damage is simply too much, spread across too many systems, too deep into the architecture of even your transhuman body to be knitted back together by the furious repair work your physiology knows how to do. The apothecary kneels over you. He harvests your gene seed before anything else, because the chapter's future matters more than any individual warrior, even one as decorated as you. And then he does something else. Something that, depending on how you look at it, either saves your life or ensures you never truly die. He calls for a dreadnought. And here is where things get fascinating, and deeply, quietly, beautifully strange. Because what happens next, the process, the transformation, was the existence that follows, is not something the Warhammer 40,000 setting treats lightly. It is not a simple upgrade. It is not a reward that leaves you happier and more capable than before. What happens when a space marine becomes a dreadnought is one of the most layered, melancholy, and philosophically rich transformations in the entire setting. It is a thing that sits somewhere between resurrection and imprisonment, between honor and horror, between living forever and never truly being alive again. It is both the highest recognition a chapter can bestow and, if you read the accounts carefully, something that the people being honored often understand, at some level, that the language of ceremony does not quite allow them to express, is also a terrible thing. That is what we are going to explore today. Every step, every sensation, every quiet implication that the lore tends to leave unspoken, but that you can feel pressing against the edges of the text when you spend enough time with it. We are going to walk through what actually happens, the wounds that earn the sarcophagus, the surgery itself, the cold baptism of amniotic fluid and neural wire, the strange half-life of stasis sleep, the long and gradual erosion of memory across centuries, the experience of combat in a 12-ton walking weapons platform that moves like an extension of your own nervous system, and finally the question that haunts every dreadnought ever entombed in iron and adamantium. Was this honor, or was this something else entirely? Settle in. Let's talk about it. The wound that earns the tomb. Not every space marine who falls in battle gets to become a dreadnought. That is the first thing you need to understand, and it shifts the meaning of everything that follows. The Adeptus Astartes suffer casualties constantly. The universe they inhabit is one of unrelenting warfare, and even the most enhanced, most genetically perfect warriors in the Imperium's arsenal take losses. Brothers fall in every engagement cut down by bolter fire or alien claws, or the slow grinding work of a siege that does not care how physically remarkable you are. Some die cleanly, in an instant, their gene seed harvested and their names carved into rolls of honor by apothecaries, whose job it is to ensure that even in death the fallen contribute to the chapter's future. Others linger. Their bodies are torn and broken, kept alive only by the extraordinary resilience of their altered physiology, or by the Susan membrane that can put a space marine into a form of induced suspended animation by the Laraman cells that rush to seal wounds in a layer of scar tissue before blood loss becomes irreversible. These warriors, the ones who survive the unsurvivable by virtue of what they are the ones who matter to our story tonight. For a space marine to be considered for interment in a dreadnought, the damage to their body has to be catastrophic in a very specific way. It cannot simply be a lost limb. The Imperium is perfectly capable of replacing lost limbs with cybernetic augmetics, and indeed many space marines walk around with bionic arms, augmetic eyes, and reinforced skeletal sections without anyone treating them as exceptional cases. Lost limbs are wounds. They are not the wound. Or a space marine who has lost an arm and had it replaced with a functioning bionic is still a capable, deployable warrior. The apothecaries have seen worse, and will see worse again. The wound in question has to be something that cannot be repaired. It has to be damage so comprehensive, so deep, so thoroughly distributed through the body's vital systems that restoration to full fighting capability, or even basic independent survival without constant medical intervention, is simply impossible. Shattered spines that have severed the neural connections between brain and body below the neck. Organs that have been reduced to fragments, their functions simply ceased, their structural integrity gone entirely. Nervous systems that have been so severely damaged that the signals which tell a body to breathe, to pump blood, to maintain the 1,000 quiet processes of life simply cannot travel properly anymore. Cranial trauma significant enough to affect consciousness and coordination, combined with other damage that makes full recovery medically implausible. The kind of destruction where, if this were a normal human being, death would have come within seconds, and the only question remaining would be which prayers to say over the cooling body and whether the family would want to know. But space marines are not normal human beings, and their physiology's extraordinary stubbornness means that sometimes a spark of consciousness persists even when the body housing it is broken beyond any conventional salvation. The gene seed implants that transform a human recruit into a transhuman warrior do not merely improve combat performance, whilst they alter the fundamental parameters of what it means to be physically alive. A space marine can survive conditions that would kill anything else. Sometimes this is a blessing. Sometimes, in the moments after a truly terrible wound, it simply means the dying takes longer. And it is that spark, that last guttering candle flame of a warrior's life, persisting against all reason in the wreckage of a broken body, that the chapter must decide what to do with. The decision itself is not automatic. It is not purely medical. It is, in most chapters, a deliberation involving multiple parties with multiple considerations. The apothecaries assess whether the body can be stabilized long enough for interment, whether the biological remnant that would need to survive the transition to sarcophagus is viable. This is not a simple calculation. Yet the minimum viable biological component for consciousness to persist inside the sarcophagus is fairly well understood, primarily the brain, the spinal cord as far as it remains functional, the vital organs required to support brain function, and as much of the original nervous system as can be maintained and then interfaced with the incoming mechanical systems. But whether any given warrior's remnant meets this threshold is a judgment that requires genuine medical expertise and a certain willingness to be honest about probabilities. The chaplains consider something different. They assess the spiritual dimension, whether the warrior's soul, as they would phrase it, is strong enough. Whether the faith and the conviction that have sustained this particular brother through his career in service are sufficient to carry him through the transformation and everything that follows. This is not a mystical assessment entirely separate from the practical one. because the psychological strength required to successfully transition into Dreadnought existence is genuinely extraordinary. Warriors who go into the sarcophagus already psychologically damaged, already close to breaking, do not tend to emerge as functioning Dreadnoughts. The mind that must control the Dreadnought's vast body, that must process the sensory replacement the neural interfaces impose, that must maintain coherent identity across centuries of stasis sleep, that mind needs to be, at its foundations, solid. The chapter leadership makes the final judgment, and their consideration is explicitly about value. Not value in a cold or heartless sense, but in a considered one. Dreadnoughts are rare. Their chassis are ancient beyond reckoning, the knowledge of building new ones largely lost in the chaos of 10,000 years of warfare, religious ossification, and the constant degradation of understanding that plagues the Imperium's relationship with its own technology. Every Dreadnought chassis in a chapter's arsenal is a precious and irreplaceable thing, and the warrior placed inside one will occupy that sarcophagus effectively forever, or until the chassis is destroyed in battle, which is the only end the law provides. The choice carries weight that most military decisions do not. What they are looking for, as when they look at the ruined body of a dying space marine and ask whether he should be given this particular form of continuation, is excellence. Genuine, documented, undeniable excellence. Not just competence. Every space marine is competent, by definition. That is what the training and the gene seed and the long years of formation produce. What earns a warrior the Dreadnought is a career of exceptional achievement, a record of tactical brilliance and inspirational leadership, and moments of heroism that the chapter genuinely cannot afford to lose. The venerable Dreadnoughts that inhabit fortress monasteries across the galaxy are, in many ways, the living libraries of their chapters, as the repositories of hard-won knowledge and ancient memory that would otherwise simply dissolve into the past when the bodies that held that knowledge finally cease to function. They are kept because they know things that no one alive in the chapter learned from direct experience. They were there, and in a setting where knowledge is as rare and precious as clean water on a death world, and where the Imperium has spent 10,000 years steadily losing understanding it cannot replace, being there matters enormously. So the decision is made. A dying hero is chosen, and now comes the question that the ceremony of honor tends to gloss over with the respectful language of sacred duty and the Emperor's will. Does the warrior actually want this? The law handles this with a fascinating mixture of directness and delicacy. As in the case of Grandmaster Arias of the Grey Knights, the entire chapter assembled and waited in silence for 3 days, while Arias lay at the edge of death, and his consent was inferred from a single nod when the question was put to him. In that account, the consent is real, deliberate, and clearly meaningful. A warrior who understood what he was agreeing to and said yes with the last functional movement available to him. In other accounts, the decision is made around a warrior too broken to communicate meaningfully, and what is called consent is more accurately described as an absence of expressed refusal. This is not accusatory. It is simply part of understanding what the Dreadnought actually is, and it matters for everything that comes after. The Dreadnought experience is begun on behalf of the warrior, thus for the warrior's own continuation, but the warrior's voice in the decision is often limited by the circumstances that made the decision necessary. You do not always get to choose your honors, any more than you get to choose the moment and manner of your wounds. One other thing worth establishing before we move on to the transformation itself. The variation in how different chapters approach the question of who merits interment is significant, and it produces meaningfully different populations of Dreadnoughts. The Grey Knights, whose numbers are small and whose warriors are all psychically gifted, making them extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable, have interred Grand Masters and senior officers whose knowledge of demonic threats and psychic countermeasures represents irreplaceable strategic assets. The Blood Angels, whose gene seed carries its own particular darkness, have Dreadnoughts who are in a running battle with the Black Rage. Even from within the sarcophagus, because the madness of that genetic curse does not distinguish between a warrior in flesh and a warrior in metal, The Space Wolves have their own tradition, which we will return to at length, involving the way the Canis helix, the specific genetic marker of their gene seed, interacts with the long stasis of Dreadnought sleep in ways that are occasionally catastrophic. The Iron Hands, who lost the majority of their Dreadnoughts in the drop site massacre during the Horus Heresy and have never fully replaced those losses, maintain relatively few Dreadnoughts compared to other chapters, each one correspondingly more precious and more carefully maintained. Whilst the variation tells you something important about what a Dreadnought actually represents in any given chapter's culture, not just a powerful weapon, but a specific institutional investment shaped by that chapter's particular history, wounds, and needs. The surgery, becoming the sarcophagus. The process of interring a Space Marine in a Dreadnought is carried out by a combination of the chapter's apothecaries and tech marines working in concert, often with the involvement of a tech marine of particularly high standing or an Adeptus Mechanicus priest, if the chapter has access to one who specializes in the relevant biological mechanical interface work. It is as much ritual as surgery, both disciplines blending together in the manner that characterizes most of the Imperium's relationship with its technology. But the prayers to the machine spirits are not separate from the medical procedure. They are woven through it, spoken at specific intervals, tied to specific actions, because in the Imperium's understanding of things, the machine spirit that dwells within the Dreadnought chassis must be prepared to receive a new occupant, must be addressed respectfully, must be assured that what is being done is sanctioned and proper. Whether the machine spirit is real in any meaningful sense is a theological question that individual practitioners answer differently. The rituals are conducted regardless. The process begins with stabilization. The dying warrior's body must be kept alive just long enough for the transition to be completed, which means a furious and desperate scramble to support whatever vital functions are still hanging on. Also, blood oxygenation maintained by external systems. Neural activity monitored with the most sensitive instruments available. The fragile spark of consciousness preserved through means there are as much art as science. A constant judgment call about what interventions help and what interventions cause additional damage. The Space Marine is technically alive at this stage, but only barely, and only because an elaborate web of emergency life support is doing the work that his own body can no longer do. He exists in a kind of biological suspension, held at the edge of death, waiting. Then comes what the clinical language of the official records calls preparation, and what the frankest accounts in the fiction describe as stripping. Sure, this is the part that the official literature tends to gloss over with language about the necessities of the transition, about the body's inadequate parts being set aside so that the spirit within may be given a form worthy of its service. When you read the first-person accounts scattered through the Black Library's fiction, and particularly the more unflinching novels that have chosen to explore this territory honestly, it is genuinely unsettling. The apothecaries begin removing the parts of the warrior's body that are, in the cold calculation of what comes next, unnecessary for the new existence being prepared. Limbs that cannot be preserved are removed if they would simply create complications within the sarcophagus. Sections of the torso that are beyond saving and would simply be dead weight, tissue that would rot, and that would generate infection. That would impose biological maintenance burdens on a system designed to support only the minimum viable organic component, are excised with the efficiency of long-practiced surgeons conducting a procedure they have probably performed before, though not often, because this does not happen often. The goal is to reduce the living organic component of what had been a Space Marine to the minimum necessary for consciousness to persist, primarily the brain. The spinal cord as far as it remains functional, because it is the conduit for the neural connections that will interface with the Dreadnought systems. The vital organs required to support brain function, heart, lungs, kidneys, the biological infrastructure of awareness. And as much of the nervous system as can be maintained and meaningfully interfaced with the incoming mechanical links. Everything else is set aside. Set aside is the official language. The reality is somewhat more absolute. What remains, when this process is complete, is described in the law with a phrase that has a way of lodging in the mind and refusing to leave. A tightly curled, shriveled organic component, not a body, not a warrior, a component. The word is important. A component is a part of a larger system. It has value insofar as it contributes to the system's function. It is not the system itself, and it is not the warrior who once inhabited the larger body that has now been set aside. It is a piece of biological hardware, preserved and maintained, around which an entirely new existence will be built. The way a processor chip is extracted from a destroyed device might be carefully packaged and installed in new housing. This remnant is placed into the sarcophagus, the central armoured box at the heart of what will become the Dreadnought's torso section, and the sealing process begins. First, the amniotic fluid. The lore is specific about what this fluid is like, and the specificity is meaningful. It is described as thick and viscous, heavy like oil, numbingly cold in a way that removes sensation rather than provoking it. It fills every space within the sealed sarcophagus, surrounding the organic remnant completely, and crucially, it fills the lungs. The space marine who becomes a dreadnought does not breathe air anymore. He breathes fluid, the way a developing infant breathes amniotic fluid in the womb, and the parallel is not accidental, but the lore makes it explicitly. This is, in a very real sense, a second gestation, a second birth. The old body is dying. What emerges from the sarcophagus will not be the same being that went in, and the fluid that surrounds this new beginning is the medium of transformation. The amniotic fluid serves multiple practical functions. It suspends the organic remnant in a stable position, reducing the mechanical stress of movement on what are now extremely fragile biological structures. It serves as a carrier for nutrients and oxygen, maintaining the biological processes of the brain and vital organs in a way that their reduced state and separation from normal physiological systems would not otherwise allow. What it maintains a chemical environment within the sealed container that has been carefully calibrated to support the specific biochemistry of an Astartes, which differs from normal human biochemistry in ways that make off-the-shelf solutions inadequate. The tech marines and apothecaries who maintain the fluids are performing a task that, from outside, looks like routine maintenance. From inside, it is the difference between continued consciousness and the final silence. The neural interfaces come next, and this is where the full strangeness of what is happening becomes most apparent. The Mind Impulse Unit, the MIU, is a technology that appears in various forms throughout the Imperium, allowing biological consciousness to interface with mechanical systems at a level of integration that goes beyond simple controls. Because in the context of a dreadnought, the MIU is not a simple data connection or a control system in the way that a vehicle's joystick is a control system. It is a total sensory replacement. Thin neural leads, fine as hair, and made of materials that the Adeptus Mechanicus treats as sacred and maintains with the reverence owed to relics, are threaded into what remains of the Space Marine's nervous system. This is a delicate and irreversible procedure. Each lead must connect to the correct neural pathway, must interface cleanly with the correct processing center, must not introduce feedback or signal degradation that would, over time, produce the dyschronometria and cognitive decline that unmanaged neural stress can create. The leads connect to every major sensory processing center. They plug into what was once the visual cortex, routing external optical sensor feeds directly into the center that processes sight. They connect to the auditory system, replacing the data streams from organic ears with data streams from the Dreadnought's acoustic sensors. They interface with the proprioceptive centers, the parts of the brain that once told the body where its limbs were in space and how they were oriented, replacing those signals with the positional data from the Dreadnought's hull sensors and movement systems. They connect to the motor cortex, so that the neural impulses that once drove a biological arm to move now drive an armored combat appendage weighing several hundred kilograms to do the same. Every channel through which that warrior had previously understood the world around him is now being rerouted, severed from the outside, reconnected inward to the machine. While it would be a mistake to think of this as the warrior being given new senses, it is more accurate and more honest to say that the warrior's original senses have been permanently replaced by something that performs a similar function but is not the same thing. Vision from optical sensors is not quite the same experience as vision from biological eyes. Hearing through acoustic sensors is not quite hearing. Touch through hull pressure sensors is not quite touch. They are functional equivalents that share category names with the original experiences, but diverge from them in ways that the brain must adapt to. And that adaptation, the period after first awakening when the Dreadnought's consciousness must learn to interpret these new data streams as something like the sensory experience it remembers, is one of the most disorienting periods in the entire Dreadnought existence. The sarcophagus is sealed. The amniotic fluid floods the last remaining spaces. The external life support systems transition to the sarcophagus's own integrated maintenance equipment, and then, with a series of status chimes and the deep mechanical sound of the chassis coming to readiness, the Dreadnought's primary systems come online. Somewhere inside that cold, sealed box, a consciousness that was dying begins to realize that it is not dead. Waking up iron. The first moments of consciousness inside a Dreadnought are, by all accounts within the lore, as profoundly disorienting even for a warrior who has been told what to expect, which most are not, because the condition required for interment, dying, critically, barely holding on, is not a condition from which one can easily receive and process detailed preparatory briefings. The chaplain may have spoken the words, the warrior may have heard them, but hearing the explanation of what your senses will feel like when they are replaced by mechanical equivalents is a very different thing from experiencing it. The senses come online one at a time, fed through the neural leads from the Dreadnought's sensor systems. Vision arrives first in most accounts, and the accounts that describe it tend to reach for the same kind of language. The language of almost but not quite, of recognizable but wrong. The visual field is wider than human vision, as extending further to the periphery in a way that the brain, accustomed to a human field of view, keeps trying to resolve into something it knows how to handle. The detail resolution is extraordinary, far beyond biological vision, able to pull sharp imagery from distances that would have required magnification optics before. But the color rendering is subtly different. Not wrong, not colorblind, but shifted, calibrated to the sensor's response curves, rather than the response curves of human photoreceptors, so that familiar colors look almost exactly right, and the difference only becomes apparent when you try to match a remembered shade precisely and find you cannot. And then there are the overlays, the targeting reticles and data displays that the combat systems generate automatically, is a constant layer of tactical information laid across the raw visual feed without being asked for, and without any obvious way to turn off. Range estimations to identified objects, threat assessments for moving targets, weapon status indicators, ammunition counts. The visual experience of a newly awakened Dreadnought is not just seeing the room. It is seeing the room with an insistent cascade of battlefield data rendering over everything, as if the Dreadnought's systems cannot conceive of a context in which tactical awareness is not the primary purpose of perception. Sound follows next, through acoustic sensors that cover a frequency range far wider than organic hearing. The brain, receiving this expanded acoustic data, has to learn to process it, but to identify which parts of the incoming information correspond to the sounds it remembers, voices, impacts, mechanical noise, and which parts are in registers it has never consciously processed before. Some Dreadnoughts describe this as having a kind of acoustic halo, a constant awareness of ultra-low frequencies and ultra-high frequencies that surround the normal auditory space like a frame around a painting. The adjustment takes time. The adaptation is never quite complete. The mechanical translation of acoustic data into something the brain reads as hearing remains, according to the long-term accounts, always very slightly off. Like a recording that has been very accurately made but somehow lacks something ineffable that the original had. What comes through the hull's pressure sensors as a substitute for touch is more difficult to describe, and the accounts that try tend to give up partway through and admit that no adequate description exists. The resolution is simply too coarse. What skin can perceive in extraordinary detail? Texture, temperature, pressure, the subtle qualities that distinguish surfaces and materials, and the weight of different objects. The hull sensors reduce to a blunter signal, a sense of contact and the rough magnitude of force. A heavy blow to the hull registers as a significant pressure event. The grip of a power fist around a target registers as resistance. But the grain of a surface, the warmth of a living body, the specific quality of different materials, these things are gone, was replaced by data points that say something is there but not what it is like. There is no smell, there is no taste. These senses simply have no mechanical equivalent within the Dreadnought's systems, and nothing in the design provides a substitute. They are gone as fully as the limbs that were removed, and they leave a specific kind of absence that the accounts describe with notable consistency. It is not the absence of sight, which has a substitute that the brain can learn to accept. It is the absence of things that cannot be substituted, that can only be remembered, and that the memory system releases gradually over the long centuries of stasis sleep into something more abstract and less sensory. In the first hours of awakening, the newly interred Dreadnought must confront all of this simultaneously. The relearning of vision, the relearning of hearing, the loss of touch as it was known, the permanent silence of smell and taste, the strangeness of the body, the vast, armoured, mechanical body that moves in response to neural intentions the way the old body moved, but whose scale and material and feedback are entirely different. It is a testament to the psychological resilience that the Dreadnought program selects. For that, most warriors navigate this transition without breaking. There is a specific challenge that the lore identifies, one that deserves particular attention, because it illuminates something important about what the consciousness inside the sarcophagus is always fighting against. If the newly interred Dreadnought does not immediately, actively, focus on controlling the Dreadnought's mechanical body, if the warrior does not push forward into the new experience and commit to it, the mind will snap back to the natural state of awareness it has defaulted to its entire life, the awareness of a physical body. And the physical body, as we have established, is a broken, ruined, excised remnant of itself, curled in cold fluid inside a sealed metal box, threaded through with wires, having what is now a genuinely irreversible and permanent conversation with machinery that keeps it functional. The descriptions of what happens to the rare new Dreadnoughts who cannot make this mental transition, who retreat into the reality of what their body has become, rather than accepting the reality of the machine they now inhabit, are not comfortable reading. The dyschronometria that arrives within hours rather than centuries, a profound and unresponsive lethargy, the sarcophagus's life support maintaining a consciousness that has turned entirely inward and cannot find a way back out. The ones who make it, and most do, because the warriors selected for this honor, are precisely the ones with the mental architecture to push through the most extraordinary experiences, find something waiting for them on the other side of that first disorientation. A body, not their original body, but a body. And when that body moves, when the first intentional movement of a Dreadnought lifts 12 tons of ceramite and iron as smoothly as a human arm raises a cup, something shifts. The disorientation does not disappear, but something else arrives alongside it, something that functions like recognition. This is me. This is what I am now. This is the body I will fight in. And then, once that recognition settles, the purpose reasserts itself, as it always does for these warriors. The chapter has need of you. The battle continues, and the Dreadnought takes its first step. Life in the stasis vault between battles. And for a Dreadnought, between battles can mean between years, between decades, sometimes between full centuries. The sarcophagus is removed from the Dreadnought chassis, carried to the chapter's armory or the dedicated chapel that most fortress monasteries maintain for their honored dead. and placed in a stasis vault. The life support systems transition from active management to a much slower, quieter mode that keeps the organic components suspended in biological near stasis. The neural interfaces go quiet, the sensor feeds cut out. The vast mechanical body, standing empty in the hall like a monument to something absent, ceases to be inhabited. What happens to the consciousness inside during these periods of stasis is one of the most quietly significant aspects of Dreadnought lore, and it is worth spending real time here because it changes everything about how you understand what a Dreadnought actually is and what the experience of being one actually costs. The sleep is not like any sleep you know. This is stated plainly in the lore and stated obliquely in almost every first-person account. It is not rest in any sense that connects to the biological experience of fatigue and recovery. It is not dreaming, although some dreadnoughts, particularly those whose stasis conditions are imperfect or who are in older sarcophagi, whose systems have degraded over time, report fragments that might be dreams, scraps of imagery or sensation or half-formed memory that cling to the edges of awareness during especially long periods of suspension. For the most part, the stasis is precisely what the word suggests: a cessation, a stop. Time passes outside the vault, measured in decades and then in centuries, while inside the consciousness of the entombed warrior effectively does not experience those years at all. You cease, and then you exist again, and the gap is simply that, a gap in the record of your experience. No passage, no sense of time, nothing that could be described as rest, because rest implies an experience of recovery, and there is no experience of the intervening time to recover from. The problem is what that gap does to the parts of consciousness that are not mechanical. And this is the part of the Dreadnought experience that the lore handles with a particular kind of careful honesty that stands out in the broader setting. The neural interfaces of a Dreadnought are extraordinary technology, and they preserve a great deal. The tactical knowledge encoded in the MIU systems, the procedural memories of combat and strategy and command, these are maintained with relatively little degradation because they are essentially data stored in a medium designed for storage. But the brain, the organic brain, suspended in amniotic fluid within the sealed sarcophagus, is not data storage in that clean sense. It is a biological organ, and biological organs change. The neurons that hold memories are subject to the same slow processes that affect all neural tissue over time, even under stasis conditions. The stasis slows these processes enormously. It does not stop them. What this means in practice is that with every awakening, the Dreadnought surfaces into consciousness with slightly less of its past than it had before. The most recent memories tend to be clearest. The last battle, the last conversation, the last moment before the sarcophagus was sealed are generally well preserved because they are recent and thus have had the least time to degrade. The oldest memories, the ones from the life before the sarcophagus, are the most vulnerable, both because they are oldest and because they are the memories with the least mechanical reinforcement. They exist only in organic tissue, and only in the slow chemical processes of biological memory, and they are subject to a gradual erosion that no amount of techmarine maintenance can fully reverse. The lore gives this condition a clinical name, dyschronometria, a disorder of temporal perception in its technical definition, but in practice something broader and more melancholy, the experience of having your relationship to your own history become progressively less reliable, of finding that what you remember and what happened have begun to diverge in ways you cannot fully track. The lore also lists other conditions that extended neural interfacing with a vehicle as large and complex as a Dreadnought produces in the occupant over time: lethargy, confusion, and eventually, in the most extreme cases, it's a form of senility that can leave a warrior of enormous historical significance convinced, in disoriented waking moments, that he is still fighting a battle that ended 1,000 years ago. Consider what this means in concrete human terms. Consider a space marine who was interred in a Dreadnought, say, 3,000 years ago. He had, at the time of his interment, a lifetime of experiences.
Okay, I want to pause here for a second because honestly, this is the part of the Dreadnought lore that got me. Like, when I first started going down this rabbit hole and reading through all of it, I kept expecting the story to be simple. Big walking tank, legendary warrior, immortal hero of the chapter, awesome, cool, end. But the more I read, the more I just kept sitting there thinking this is genuinely one of the most tragic things in all of 40k. And I say that as someone who thinks 40k is basically a competition to see who can suffer the most. Dreadnought wins that competition quietly. No drama, no grand villain, no apocalypse, just a man alone in the dark, slowly forgetting who he used to be. That hits different to me than most of the lore does, and it's a big part of why I wanted to make this video. But anyway, that was just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
However distant and half-formed those early memories might be, childhood on whatever world he came from before the recruiters found him, the brutal process of becoming an Astartes, the first years of service, the gradual accumulation of a warrior's history, they were his. They constituted the specific texture of being that particular person. Across 3,000 years of stasis cycles, punctuated by awakenings of varying lengths, but those memories have been subject to continuous biological erosion. What remains of that original person now is not nothing. The core personality structure, the fundamental values and drives, and characteristic responses that define who someone is, rather than what they have experienced. These tend to be more resilient than specific episodic memories. The tactical knowledge encoded in the MIU's mechanical systems is largely intact, and may even have accumulated across the centuries of service. The long-term patterns of behavior, the habits of mind that constitute character rather than biography, these persist in recognizable form much longer than the specific details of individual events. But the specific textures of the old life dissolve. The face of the sergeant who trained him becomes a shape without features. What the sound of his own laughter from before the sarcophagus is a category memory. He knows he laughed, he knows what laughter is, but the specific pitch and quality of that laughter is gone. The smell of the first world he defended, the weight of a bolter in biological hands, the precise feeling of cold mountain air on skin that could actually feel it. These things become increasingly abstract, remembered as categories and types, rather than as specific lived experiences. He knows he had them. He cannot recover them in the way he once could. And every time he goes back into stasis, he loses a little more. The cold of the amniotic fluid around the neural leads, the numbness of the suspension, and then nothing, for however long the chapter decides it should be nothing. As there is a passage in the lore, found in the Lexicanum's description of Dreadnought life, that describes the amniotic fluid within the sarcophagus as numbingly cold. That phrase lodges in the mind and stays there. Numbingly cold, not painfully cold, not aggressively cold, not the sharp bite of cold that snaps you into awareness. Numbingly, the cold of something that removes sensation rather than provoking it. The cold of forgetting. The tech marines who maintain the stasis vaults treat them with the reverence afforded to sacred relics, and this reverence is genuine rather than merely performed. They anoint the sarcophagi with blessed oils and sacred balms on a daily basis, murmuring prayers from the Omnissiah's liturgies, while their instruments monitor the biological status of the occupants. They check the fluid chemistry, see the stasis field intensity, the neural interface integrity, the structural integrity of the sarcophagus housing. Each of these checks is both a technical procedure and an act of devotion, the two not separable in the Imperium's way of understanding its relationship to machines. The fact that the thing being maintained is also alive, that somewhere inside the sealed metal container there is a consciousness that will, at some future point, be woken and will need to function, gives these routine procedures a weight that maintaining an ordinary piece of equipment does not carry. Younger space marines sometimes come to the Armory Chapel simply to stand in the presence of the sleeping ancients, to be near something that has seen more of the galaxy's history than they ever will, to feel the particular weight of accumulated time that hangs around those sealed metal boxes, the invisible presence of everything a dreadnought has witnessed and survived. They do not know, cannot know from outside, what the inside of that stasis is like. They imagine it as dignified, probably, as a noble sleep between battles. The gap between that imagining and the cold reality inside those vaults is something most of them will never discover. The dreadnoughts who talk about it, and the ones who have been in the sarcophagus long enough to develop the kind of reflective distance that allows honest conversation about it, tend to describe the stasis periods not with horror, but with a kind of resigned sadness that has found its own equilibrium, not fighting it, not claiming it is fine, simply carrying it, as the way Space Marines carry everything that must be carried, because it must be, and because you are the kind of thing that does what must be done. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, who knows more about this than anyone alive, is reported to have said that the loneliness of the in-between is sharper than any blade. Not the loneliness of the battle, where brothers fight alongside him and enemies press close on every side, and the world is full of urgent, immediate sensation, and everything that was lost feels temporarily beside the point. The loneliness of the dark between. The loneliness of waking up and spending a few minutes not knowing exactly how long it has been, and then finding out, and doing the arithmetic on who is still alive. Because that is the other thing about the long stasis periods. Space Marines are still mortal, yet even Space Marines who are not dreadnoughts, they live longer than ordinary humans, centuries if they are not killed in battle first, but they do not live forever. The warriors who interred a dreadnought 300 years ago are old now, or dead, and some of the ones who were old when the sarcophagus was sealed are now gone entirely. The chapter that a dreadnought returns to after a long period of stasis is the same chapter in name, in purpose, in the traditions and the gene seed and the battle honors. But the specific people who constituted that chapter at the time of the last awakening are increasingly not there anymore. New faces fill the armory. New voices repeat the litanies in the chapel. The chapter master, who once stood beside the dreadnought in battle, may now be a name on a roll of honor rather than a living presence. And the warriors who know the dreadnought as a legendary ancestor rather than a brother in arms are the ones who look up at the sarcophagus with reverence rather than recognition. A dreadnought who has been in the sarcophagus for 1,000 years is, in a very real sense, a person whose entire original social world no longer exists. Every relationship that gave the original warrior their specific human texture, the friendships that were about specific shared experiences, the rivalries that had their own history, the bonds forged in particular campaigns on particular worlds against particular enemies. All of that is gone. Not just changed, gone. Replaced by new relationships with generations of warriors who only know the dreadnought as a figure of legend, an ancient, a thing that was old before their grandmasters were born. As these younger warriors revere the dreadnought, they study its words, they attend its awakenings with appropriate ceremony, but they did not fight beside it in the battles that defined it, and it is not sure, after long enough, that it remembers those battles in the granular, personal way that makes them real, rather than simply part of a recorded tactical database. This is the cost of living forever, as it operates in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Not the dramatic horror of the Chaos Dreadnaught's existence, not the immediate agony of the Hellbrute's waking nightmare, the quieter, more patient, more total erosion of the specific human texture of a specific life, replaced over centuries by something cleaner and emptier and less itself. On the battlefield, what it feels like to fight for all the melancholy of the stasis vault, and for all the philosophical weight of the dreadnaught's long experience of time. These entities are not kept alive for their melancholy. They are not maintained through centuries of careful effort and devoted technical attention because the chapter finds their sadness interesting. They are maintained because when the sarcophagus is installed back into the chassis, when the neural interfaces come back online, and the mechanical body receives its returning pilot, what walks onto the battlefield is something that no other unit in the Space Marine order of battle can replicate. A standard Castroferrum pattern Dreadnought, the most common variant in use in the 41st millennium, stands roughly 4 meters tall and masses somewhere in the range of 12 tons, though the specific numbers vary with weapon configuration and chassis generation. What in visual terms, this is something between the scale of a large vehicle and the scale of a small building, compact and densely armored in a way that makes it feel heavier and more solid than its dimensions alone might suggest. The ceramite and adamantium that compose its outer hull are the same materials used in Space Marine armor and in the most heavily protected military vehicles in the Imperium's arsenal. Enemy fire that would disable a tank has been known to merely leave scoring marks on an ancient dreadnought whose hull has been maintained across centuries. From inside the sarcophagus, this scale does not feel enormous. This is one of the more counterintuitive aspects of the dreadnought experience, and it is one that the accounts consistently describe with a note of surprised wonder in the early awakenings before adaptation makes it simply natural. The proprioceptive systems that map the dreadnought's physical presence in space feed the warrior's spatial awareness centers with information that the adapted brain processes as directly and unconsciously as it once processed the dimensions of a biological body. The 4 meters of height register not as a constant reminder of scale, but as simply where the eyes are and how the world looks from there. The width of a doorway registers as a direct, intuitive sense of whether the dreadnought can fit through it, not as a calculation, but as a feeling. The ceiling registers as close or comfortable. The corridor registers as too narrow to maneuver in or as adequate. The weapons are, just in the truest functional sense, hands. Not tools attached to a machine's appendages, not weapons mounted on a vehicle's hardpoints. Hands. The intention to fire the assault cannon travels from the motor cortex through the neural lead to the weapon system in essentially the same neural milliseconds that an intention to make a gesture would travel from brain to arm. There is no intermediate step, no conscious translation from biological intention to machine control, no awareness of the interface itself. The warrior means for the weapon to fire, and the weapon fires. The cannon barrel tracks where attention directs it as naturally as eyes track a moving object, which when rounds stop, whether from a jam that the mechanical systems are already working to resolve, or from a magazine change already underway. The awareness of this is immediate and precise, fed back through the same neural channels as proprioception, as integrated into the warrior's sense of their own body as the awareness of a hand that has gone numb. The power fist that closes around an enemy vehicle, applying the hydraulic force of 12 tons of combat walker to whatever is caught within it, closes with the same neural intention that once closed a biological hand around a grip. The feedback through the pressure sensors, coarse as those sensors are, limited in the texture and detail they can communicate, registers the resistance of whatever is being crushed in a way that the adapted brain interprets, dimly but unmistakably, as a form of touch. Not the touch of skin, something more mechanical and less specific, but the feedback of purposeful physical action applied to the world, which is a kind of information the warrior's entire nervous system was shaped by training and experience to process. In combat, the dreadnought's tactical systems augment the warrior's own thinking with data feeds that run continuously beneath the primary sensory experience. Enemy position data from Auspex scans, updating in real time as targets move. Structural analysis of cover and defensive positions, identifying weaknesses and optimal approaches. Ammunition loadout data, always present at the edge of awareness, counting down toward the thresholds that will require tactical adjustment. Damage assessment reports from the whole sensor network, narrating in real time which sections of armor have sustained hits and how severe those hits were. Flagging systems that are operating at reduced capacity, noting when a particular appendage's movement systems have been degraded enough to affect precision. A Space Marine in power armor already has access to helmet displays and tactical data that makes the ordinary soldier's situational awareness seem primitive. A dreadnought operates at a level of information integration beyond even that. The combat purpose animates the Dreadnought in a way that the long stasis does not. Some accounts describe Dreadnoughts as coming most fully alive in the moments of battle, and as if the mechanical body has found its highest expression in the function it was designed for, and the consciousness within it responds to this alignment of purpose and capability with something that, if it is not joy, is at minimum the thing that joy leaves behind when it fades slightly across centuries. The sounds of the assault cannon, the shudder through the hull as enemy fire strikes ceramite, the visceral mechanical satisfaction of a power fist driving through something that resisted it. All of it arrives through the translated medium of sensor data, but the warrior interprets it through the emotional architecture of a being that spent its whole life as a warrior. That architecture is still there, still responsive, still generating what functions as feeling, even if the specific edges of those feelings have smoothed slightly over time. In the early decades of a Dreadnought's existence, the battle experience is described as intensely present and personally meaningful in ways that map closely to what a space marine in biological form would experience. Anger at the enemies of the Emperor, protectiveness toward the brothers fighting alongside, the particular electric focus of a warrior in the moment of crisis, the satisfaction of objectives achieved and threats eliminated. These responses are intact because the warrior is still early in the long transition, still carrying enough of the original emotional texture to respond to situations the way the original person would have responded to them. What happens over centuries and millennia is subtler and more troubling. As the emotional responses remain, the anger, the protectiveness, the focus, but their quality shifts. They become more reliable and less variable, less surprising, more consistent and less personal. The anger at the desecration of something sacred may become, after 500 years, a steady operational baseline rather than a rising emotional surge. The protectiveness that once drove a warrior into a dangerous position to protect a struggling brother might gradually rationalize itself into a tactical assessment of acceptable risk rather than remaining the unthinking impulse of genuine care. The battle is still fought with the same skill. The outcomes are no worse, but the experience of fighting it from inside. This is increasingly the experience of a very good machine, rather than the experience of a person who happens to be operating within a machine. The Dreadnoughts who notice this happening and talk about it tend to do so with the same resigned honesty that characterizes their descriptions of the stasis periods. Not horror, not despair, something quieter than either. The recognition of a change you cannot stop, that you are not certain is entirely bad, and that you cannot entirely mourn without seeming to suggest that the alternative, not being here at all, having died on that battlefield centuries ago, would have been preferable. It would not have been preferable, probably. It simply would have been different. And the difference is one that the language of honor, which is the language the chapter provides for talking about the Dreadnought's existence, does not entirely cover. The venerable, ancient, wisdom, reverence, and role in chapter life, Dreadnoughts are not simply weapons. They are not simply preserved warriors, waiting to be deployed at need, and then sealed back into stasis when the need has passed. In the life of a Space Marine chapter, they occupy a specific and irreplaceable position, and understanding that position fully requires understanding why the chapters go to the considerable trouble and expense and institutional devotion of maintaining them at all. The designation of Venerable Dreadnought, the most honored title in the Dreadnought hierarchy, refers less to a specific chassis pattern and more to a specific status earned over time. And a Venerable Dreadnought is one of sufficient age and demonstrated worth that its pilot has accumulated combat experience spanning multiple centuries, whose judgment has been tested and confirmed across enough variety of situations to constitute a genuine strategic resource, and whose counsel is sought not just for its fighting value, but for the depth of understanding it represents. The oldest among them carry the label ancient rather than simply venerable, a distinction that suggests not just long service, but the particular kind of proximity to origin that transforms a member of a tradition into one of its foundations. The battlefield role of the Venerable Ancient is the most obvious and the most discussed, but it is not the most important. In the line of battle, the Venerable Dreadnought is a force multiplier of a particular quality, not just because of its weapons and armor, though those are formidable, but because of what the consciousness directing them has accumulated across hundreds of years of warfare. A warrior who has faced the Tyranids several dozen times over a century of deployments does not just fight them better than a warrior facing them for the third time. He knows things about how they behave, what their tactical patterns are, what they respond to and what they do not respond to, what the moments of vulnerability look like and how briefly they last. This knowledge exists in the databases too, recorded and accessible. But knowledge in a database is inert. Knowledge in a consciousness is alive. It can be interrogated, extended, and applied to novel situations that the database could not have anticipated, modified in real time by the intuition that only comes from having actually been there. The Venerable Dreadnought deployed in a critical engagement is, consequently, something more than a powerful weapon system. It is an advisor that can also punch through the hull of an armored vehicle. It is a counselor that carries an assault cannon. The chapter leadership does not just send it forward and let the tactical systems do their work. They consult it, they brief it, they listen when it speaks, and they give its assessments the weight they deserve from a source that has done this kind of work longer than most of the people in the briefing room have been alive. Off the battlefield, the Venerable Ancient's role is even more specifically irreplaceable. Was the living archive function, the ability to ask a question about a campaign that happened 3 centuries ago and receive an answer from a consciousness that was present, is something that no amount of meticulous record-keeping can fully substitute for. Records are incomplete. Records reflect the understanding and the biases of whoever made them, filtered through whatever information was available at the time. The Dreadnought who was there, standing in the middle of the relevant events, provides something records cannot: the specific, experiential knowledge of what it actually felt like from the inside, what was known at the time and what was not, what the enemy was doing that the official reports do not mention, because the official reports were written by people who were not paying attention to that particular detail. Chapter masters consult their Venerable Dreadnoughts before significant decisions. When a chapter faces a tactical challenge that echoes a conflict from the distant past, the most efficient source of relevant information is often not the scriptoria, but the armory chapel. When a chapter faces an internal crisis, a question about tradition, about identity, about what the chapter's founders would have wanted, the Dreadnought who was around when those traditions were being formed is not just a source of information. It is a source of authority. The declaration of what something has always meant, delivered by someone who was there when it first meant it, carries weight that no amount of later interpretation can match. The reverence that chapters show their dreadnoughts is genuine rather than merely ceremonial, and it manifests in practices that are worth understanding because they illuminate what the relationship between a chapter and its ancient warriors actually is. The sepulchres that house the stasis vaults are maintained as sacred spaces. Tech Marines who tend them treat the work as devotion, the anointing of sarcophagi with blessed oils, the recitation of maintenance liturgies over the mechanical systems, the daily checks that combine technical precision with prayerful intention. These are the practices of people who genuinely believe that what they are caring for matters in a way that transcends its tactical value. Some chapters go further. The Space Wolves hold a great feast in which Bjorn the Fell-Handed, when awakened, recounts elements of his saga to the assembled brothers, a formal act of narrative transmission in which the living history speaks directly to the next generation. The ceremony is simultaneously a religious ritual, a military briefing, and something more personal than either. The oldest warrior in the Imperium telling the youngest generation of Space Wolves about what it was like to stand beside their Primarch, to see the galaxy when it was younger, and the Imperium was new, and the dreams of that era were not yet entirely broken. The Chaplain Dreadnought represents a particular crystallization of what this revered role can be. A A chaplain who has been interred in a dreadnought becomes something the lore calls a living shrine, and the phrase earns its weight. In biological form, as a chaplain delivers his sermons and his litanies through a voice that is powerful but ultimately human in scale. In the dreadnought chassis, those same words emerge through voxcasters capable of projecting across entire battlefields the ancient words of devotion and exhortation delivered through a throat made of amplification circuits, the voice mechanical, but the content, the spiritual authority, the centuries of devotion, the unbroken thread of service, entirely, unmistakably real. Brothers who fight beneath that booming mechanical voice describe it as among the most stirring things they have ever heard, not because the voice is beautiful, but because of what the voice represents. The proof that devotion can survive anything. Bjorn the Fell-Handed and other legendary dreadnoughts. Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves is, in most assessments, the most famous dreadnought in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, and his story is worth examining in full because it illuminates the experience more completely than almost any other figure in the lore. He fought beside the Primarch Lemon Russ during the Great Crusade, the vast project in which the Emperor of Mankind led his Space Marine legions across the galaxy to bring all of humanity's scattered worlds under a single civilizational banner. He was present at the Battle of Prospero, where the Space Wolves devastated the Thousand Suns homeworld on the Emperor's orders. He was still whole in body when the Horus Heresy began, though he had already lost his left hand in the battle on Prospero to a creature of chaos, either to the psychic fire of a Thousand Suns sorcerer, or to Caspar Horsa's axe cutting the arm away to prevent the corruption from spreading, depending on which account you read. This loss gave him the epithet fell-handed, meaning damaged or withered in the hand, and it is the kind of name that Space Wolves give to acknowledge both the loss and the endurance of the warrior who suffered it. He fought through the Horus Heresy. When Leman Russ departed for the Eye of Terror with his personal wolf guard and vanished from Imperial records in a way that has never been explained to anyone's satisfaction, Bjorn was the warrior left behind. Left behind with no explanation, no stated timeline for return, no indication of whether Russ intended to come back at all. And this ambiguity has apparently never resolved itself in Bjorn's mind across 10,000 years of waiting. What the bitterness is a specific and historically grounded bitterness. It is not the general melancholy of long existence. It is the specific grief of a person who cared deeply about someone who left without saying goodbye, or why, or when. Bjorn became the first Great Wolf, the Space Wolves' equivalent of Chapter Master, in Leman Russ's absence. He led the chapter through the long years of reconstruction after the heresy, guided the formation of what would become the Space Wolves as the Codex Astartes era, chapter they remain in the 41st Millennium. And then, during the Proxima Rebellion in 934 of the 31st Millennium, he was so severely wounded that the Iron Priests placed him in a dreadnought rather than watch him die. Over the following 5 centuries, he fought constantly. Was the bitterness about Russ apparently serving as the fuel that kept him going, rather than sinking into the detachment that eventually takes most dreadnoughts? His kill count in those 5 centuries is described as exceeding the total count of some entire chapters. And then the long years began to catch up, even with his exceptional stamina, and the intervals of stasis grew longer, and the awakenings grew shorter. By the 41st Millennium, Bjorn is more than 10,000 years old. He has been in the sarcophagus longer than many historical civilizations on pre-spaceflight Earth existed as recognizable entities. He is specifically awakened once every 1,000 years, or when the chapter's need is dire enough to warrant disturbing what everyone understands is a preservation that costs him more than it should. At those awakenings, the chapter is attentive and reverent in a way that suggests genuine understanding, or the closest approach to it that is available from outside. They know what they are asking. They ask anyway, because what he knows is irreplaceable, and because the Imperium cannot afford to let irreplaceable things go. The lore notes that Bjorn has begun, over the centuries, to give increasingly vague and confusing answers when awakened purely for the storytelling ceremonies of the Great Feast. There is a theory that this is performance, that Bjorn, who is not actually senile and demonstrates perfect tactical coherence whenever deployed in actual combat, is pretending to be more confused than he is in the hope that the wolves will eventually leave him alone to rest. So whether this is actually pretense or genuine deterioration in the specific context of narrative memory rather than tactical memory is a question the lore carefully declines to answer. Both possibilities are plausible. Both possibilities say something true about the Dreadnought experience. Beyond Bjorn, the roles of famous Dreadnoughts stretch across every chapter and every era of the setting's history. Venerable brother Deimos of the Angels Porphyr served for more than 3,000 years after his interment following a devastating bombing run, holding the chapter's 9th company's tactical traditions in memory across the entire span of that service. Ancient Rylanor of the Emperor's Children, now a traitor legion, but Rylanor himself a loyalist who held to his oaths even as the chapter around him fell, endured for 10,000 years in the service of ideals that his brothers had abandoned, a living refutation of the choice Fulgrim made, preserved against all probability by the sheer stubbornness of a consciousness that had not consented to damnation and would not start. His end, when it came, was chosen sacrifice rather than defeat. Venerable Deimos, Rylanor, Bjorn. These are stories of extraordinary persistence, of consciousness maintaining its integrity against forces that would erode it, each successful in a different way and at a different cost. Grandmaster Arias of the Grey Knights, whose single nod gave consent to his interment while the entire chapter watched, Ash was present for some of the most significant events in the chapter's long history of fighting things that should not exist. The tactical database he accumulated across centuries of anti-demonic warfare is, from a purely utilitarian perspective, extraordinarily valuable. What the warrior himself has paid for that value, what the centuries have cost in terms of the specific person he once was, is not something the chapter's records feel obligated to address. Davian Thule of the Blood Ravens represents the modern face of the Dreadnought tradition, a captain poisoned by tyrannid venom and interred in a sarcophagus to save what could be saved. His is the story of a Dreadnought in its early years, still close enough to the original life that the connection is felt rather than remembered. He's still experiencing the transition rather than having fully made it. The Dawn of War games, if you played them, gave his story a kind of real-time intimacy that the ancient accounts of warriors like Bjorn cannot quite provide. He is the beginning of the path that all Dreadnoughts walk. Whether for 50 years or 10,000, the direction is the same. The Dark Mirror, Chaos, Dreadnoughts, and the Hellbrute. To understand what the Imperium's Dreadnoughts are, it helps enormously to understand what they are not, and nothing demonstrates what they are not as clearly as looking at what happens when the same basic technology is applied within the context of the Chaos Space Marines. The Chaos version of the Dreadnought is the Hellbrute, and the contrast between the two, same technological origin, a radically different outcome, is one of the setting's most effective pieces of world building. It works because it is not the same as saying the Loyalist version is good and the Chaos version is bad. It is more accurate and more interesting to say that the Loyalist version is carefully maintained under conditions that allow a form of survival, however compromised, and the Chaos version is the result of what happens when those conditions are absent or actively hostile. The Hellbrute is what the Dreadnought becomes without the mercy of stasis, without the devotion of the Tech Marines, without the consideration of the chapter that understands it is caring for something that still contains a person. The Horus Heresy split the Space Marine legions. The traitor legions took their technology with them when they fled into the Eye of Terror, and their Dreadnoughts went with them. Those Dreadnoughts were, at the time of the Heresy, the same kind of warriors the Loyalist Dreadnoughts were. Heroes of the Great Crusade, generals and veterans of extraordinary caliber, interred to preserve their knowledge and their fighting capacity. They had the same amniotic fluid, the same neural interfaces, the same expectation of continued service to ideals that had, at some point during the heresy, fractured beneath them. What happened over the next 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror is the horror story that the loyalist tradition was designed to prevent. The traitor legions lack the stasis technology that allows loyalist dreadnoughts to sleep through the centuries in relative preservation. Some of this is lost technical knowledge. Some of it is the warp, which does not preserve things the way physical stasis does. It changes them. It whispers to them. It applies pressure to every boundary between what something is and what the ruinous powers would prefer it to become. A sealed sarcophagus in the Eye of Terror is not a protected sanctuary. It is a target, chaos. Dreadnoughts cannot sleep, not in the sense that matters. They remain awake, or in something that functions as wakefulness, experiencing the centuries directly. And what a consciousness experiences across 10,000 years of isolation, without the mercy of periodic awakening and purpose, without brothers who treat the sarcophagus as a sacred obligation, without anything except the darkness and the waiting and the warp pressing in from every direction, is the comprehensive destruction of the mind that held it. Whilst the isolation alone would be devastating in purely psychological terms. Imagine spending years, not metaphorically years, actual years, with no ability to move unless someone unchains you, no sensory experience except whatever limited environmental data penetrates the sealed sarcophagus, no meaningful interaction with any other consciousness, no purpose, no function. Now extend that to decades, now to centuries. The lore does not need to dramatize this for it to be horrifying. The mathematics of what extended isolation does to a human mind, or any mind structured the way human minds are structured, requiring interaction and purpose and sensory engagement to remain coherent, is the horror. Add to this the warp. The Eye of Terror's constant psychic pressure, the accumulated malice of entities that have had 10,000 years to learn how to press against every interface and every weakness. The neural leads that connect the organic remnant to the machine, originally a pathway for sensory data and motor control, become pathways for other things as well. The mutation that the warp invariably produces in anything it has long contact with begins to affect the organic component inside the sarcophagus. Flesh warping in response to psychic pressure, nerves rewiring themselves according to patterns that have nothing to do with original biology or careful engineering. The boundary between organic and mechanical begins to blur. The flesh grows into the metal metal takes on qualities of the flesh. Eventually, what was a warrior sealed in a machine becomes something that is simply both at once, but neither entirely, unable to be cleanly separated. This is the Hellbrute state, and the lore is precise about what the consciousness experiences within it. The interface between the warp-tainted sarcophagus and the pilot is described as pseudo-parasitic. It does not simply connect the warrior to the machine, it feeds off the warrior, drawing from the pilot's soul in ways that produce constant pain. The Hellbrute pilot exists in a waking nightmare of unending physical and spiritual agony, aware enough to know what is happening and unable to do anything about it except turn the pain outward as violence. Between battles, the Hellbrute must be literally chained, heavy restraints, bolted to whatever surface it is being stored on, because the consciousness inside is mad with suffering and fury and will attack anything within reach. Or the weapons are removed, because the alternative is a rampage through the warband's own forces. The sarcophagus is disconnected from the chassis and left in the dark, in silence, fully awake and fully aware inside it. This is not a side effect of Chaos Dreadnought existence. This is the design. For Chaos Space Marines, interment in a Hellbrute is a punishment. The lore says this explicitly. Hellbrute imprisonment is used against warriors who have failed or threatened their commanders, who have survived wounds that their lords found inconvenient, who have simply been in the wrong place when a warpsmith was looking for material. The pride that a loyalist warrior is supposed to take in the honor of the Dreadnought is replaced, in chaos culture, by a recognition that this is one of the worst things that can happen to you. When the warriors who go into the sarcophagus against their will, and many do, enter it already knowing that what awaits them on the other side is not enhanced purpose, but continuous agony and progressive dissolution. Many Hellbrute pilots break almost immediately. The lore describes cases of warriors driven to irreversible insanity within solar days, or even hours, their minds turning inward and consuming themselves in the absence of any constructive outlet for the madness the process produces. Once proud Chaos Space Marines, the accounts note, rail against being reduced to a shackled lump of meat. What they are after the railing subsides is something that does not rail, does not reason, does not plan. Something that simply hates and hurts and wants to destroy. The most extreme version of this process is the Thousand Suns variant, in which the transformation is not accidental or the result of simple neglect, but a deliberate ritual inflicted on victims through sorcerous manipulation. Thousand Suns sorcerers offer knowledge and power to warriors of other warbands, establishing a connection through the offer. They then conduct a ceremony that flays the victim's body with warp fire while keeping the consciousness active throughout, reducing the victim to a mass of organs and nerve fibers, still capable of generating awareness. This is done deliberately, the consciousness being maintained precisely so it understands what is being done to it, because in the Thousand Suns calculation, the quality of the suffering matters. What is locked in the resulting Hellbrute is not just a weapon, but a memorial of the process that created it, permanently aware. Permanently aware of being aware. Permanently aware that the awareness itself is the worst part. Against this background, the Loyalist Dreadnought looks like something genuinely precious, not without its costs, not without the erosion of memory and the cold of the stasis vault and the long isolation between awakenings, but protected, cared for, maintained by people who treat the work as an obligation rather than an inconvenience, and given the mercy of sleep between the times when waking is necessary. The honor the Imperium claims to bestow on its entombed heroes is, measured against the alternative, real. The many patterns, from Castroferrum to Redemptor, the variation in Dreadnought chassis patterns across the history of the 41st millennium is significant beyond the merely technical, because each pattern reflects the era that produced it and the specific understanding of what a Dreadnought is meant to be that prevailed at the time of its design. The Castroferrum pattern Dreadnought is the most common type in active use in the 41st millennium, the blocky, compact, wide-shouldered form that most people picture when they hear the word Dreadnought in a 40,000 context. Its profile is recognizable across every Space Marine chapter and in imagery from tabletop battlefields, games and artwork. That thick-limbed, slightly hunched silhouette with the sarcophagus housing visible on the chest and a purposeful, industrial solidity that suggests a thing made to endure rather than to be elegant. The Castroferrum's design was specifically developed for versatility in enclosed environments, shipboard fighting, tunnel warfare, and hive city operations, the kinds of combat that its relatively low, wide profile is suited for. Its thermic reactor is based on technology that, while not simple, is better understood by 41st millennium tech marines than many of the alternatives, which is the primary reason it has remained in production when more advanced patterns have become effectively impossible to manufacture. The Contemptor pattern predates the Castroferrum significantly, dating to the late 30th millennium and the early years of the Great Crusade. It is larger, faster, and more capable in several specific ways, most notably the atomantic field generator technology built into its hull, which creates an energy shield that can deflect significant incoming fire. The Contemptor is also notably more human in its proportions than the Castroferrum, but with a head assembly that gives it a silhouette closer to a massive armored person than to a walking fortress. And this design choice reflects a philosophy of the MAEU interface that held, at the time of its creation, that closer correspondence between the machine's external form and the pilot's remembered body, aided in the psychological adaptation to the neural interface. Whether this theory is correct is difficult to test, but the Contemptor's pilots do tend, in the accounts available, to describe the experience of inhabiting it differently than Castroferrum pilots describe their experience, with a somewhat greater ease, a slightly less jarring quality to the sensory translation. The Contemptor has become extraordinarily rare in the 41st millennium. The understanding needed to build new ones has been lost, and the existing examples have been maintained through centuries of accumulated technical improvisation by tech marines who are working from incomplete knowledge, as much artists as engineers. The chapters that still possess operational Contemptors treat them as relics of the First Order, their sarcophagi embellished with scripture and honor scrolls, their maintenance rituals performed with additional ceremony, their pilots consulted with the deference owed to something irreplaceable and irreproducible. The Leviathan pattern siege Dreadnought is the largest and most powerful of the patterns in common use before the Primaris era, and everything about it communicates this. It is broader and more massively armoured than the Castroferrum, designed for the specific demands of siege warfare, the sustained advance under devastating fire, at the assault on fortified positions where the answer to everything blocking the path forward is simply to apply more force than it can withstand. The weapons most commonly mounted on a Leviathan are oriented toward this purpose. Siege claw, siege drill, storm cannon, all of them tools for breaking things rather than for precision. The pilot inside a Leviathan is under considerably greater physical and psychological stress than in any other pattern. The power requirements of the chassis, the sensory load of all the systems operating at once, the specific interface demands of a machine this large, all of it pushes against the limits of what the MIU connection can transmit without causing damage to the organic systems on the receiving end. Leviathans are reserved for the moments when nothing else will suffice. It was brought out of their deep vaults with the understanding that what is being asked of the pilot is significant even by Dreadnought standards. The Redemptor pattern is the newest addition to the family, designed by Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call as part of the broader Primaris Space Marine project. The Primaris Marines are physically larger than their predecessors. The additional genetic enhancements that distinguish them producing bodies that the older Castroferrum chassis would accommodate only with considerable modification. The Redemptor was built to house them without compromise, and the result is a Dreadnought that is noticeably more capable in specific ways, particularly in the aggressive assault roles that Primaris Doctrine emphasizes. As the Onslaught Gatling cannon that occupies one arm fires with a sustained volume of fire that few other Dreadnought weapon systems can match. The Redemptor Fist applies force with precision that the older Power Fist designs cannot quite duplicate. The chassis is faster and more maneuverable than the Castroferrum, capable of advancing alongside assault units in ways that older Dreadnoughts cannot sustain. But the Redemptor comes with a cost that the lore states plainly, and that distinguishes it from every older pattern in a troubling way. The Mechanicus tech priests who designed it were optimizing for battlefield performance, and in the process they gave insufficient consideration to what the machine's demands do to the biological component inside. The surging energies of the Redemptor's systems have a tendency to burn out the pilot faster than older patterns do. The power demands leaching from the organic component in ways that older designs avoid through less aggressive energy management. There are Redemptors already in service, the lore notes, that have had their sarcophagi replaced. The original pilots consumed by the machine's intensity, reduced to something that can no longer sustain consciousness, interred in a proper mausoleum with the honours their sacrifice earned, while a new pilot is found to take their place. The tech marine who maintains a Redemptor is tending a machine that is genuinely excellent at its purpose, and genuinely harder on the person inside it than its designers apparently cared to manage. The warrior who accepts interment in one accepts it knowing this, which says something about the kind of people Space Marines are, and the kind of choices the Imperium requires of them. Murderfang and the loss of self. If the Dreadnought existence is defined by anything beyond the mechanical reality of the sarcophagus and the stasis vault, it is defined by the tension between preservation and erosion. The chapter's earnest effort to maintain the warrior's identity across centuries of suspension and the slow, organic, biologically unstoppable way in which that identity dissolves regardless. Most Dreadnoughts manage this tension better than others. Many maintain coherence across centuries, even a millennium or more, through the combination of their own psychological resilience the chapter's careful management of their sleep cycles, or to the particular luck of a personality structure that anchors itself through purpose, rather than through the kinds of specific sensory memory most vulnerable to biological degradation. Bjorn manages it through the specific, detailed, unresolved anger that has apparently anchored him across 10,000 years. A grief too particular to dissolve into abstraction, an injustice too specific to fade into generalized discontent. Other dreadnoughts find other anchors, dedication to a specific doctrine, particular attachment to the chapter's identity and continued existence, the love of a warrior for the brothers who will outlive them, but some do not manage it. And the Space Wolves have given the most famous example of what complete failure looks like, a name that is, if nothing else, appropriately honest about what it designates: Murderfang. And Logan Grimnar's great company found what would come to be called Murderfang on the hell world of Omnicide in 960 of the 41st Millennium, fighting alone against a force of Chaos Space Marines with a fury that was technically impressive, but entirely without tactical coherence. The Space Wolves joined the melee, and when it was over, they discovered that the feral dreadnought's fury did not subside. It turned on whatever was nearby, friend and foe without distinction, because the distinction between friend and foe requires a kind of cognitive processing that the thing inside the sarcophagus no longer performed. Shen attempts to communicate with the entombed warrior produced only what the lore describes as metallic snarls, sounds that the audio analysis system struggled to classify as language because whatever was generating them was no longer generating language. The identity of the warrior once inside the sarcophagus is listed in the records as simply unknown. The name, the rank, the history, the chapter record, all of it has been lost to time and mutation, and whatever happened inside that sarcophagus, across however many centuries it had been sealed, the Canis Helix, the Space Wolves' specific genetic heritage, the marker that gives their warriors their enhanced senses and their predatory quality and their susceptibility to the Wolfen curse, had activated within the biological remnant during the long stasis, and as it sometimes does when the body is under sufficient stress or the stasis conditions are sufficiently disrupted. The mutation had spread through the organic component, and then, through the neural interfaces, into the machine itself. The flesh had changed. The metal had changed. What looked, from outside, like a Space Wolves dreadnought had become something that wore the shape of one, but was no longer one in any meaningful sense. The identity of the warrior was, as the lore says, long lost, not absent. Something was still in there, still animating the machine, still generating the continuous output of predatory fury that constituted Murderfang's entire remaining behavioral repertoire. But whatever that remnant had been before the Wolfen curse consumed it was as inaccessible as if it had never existed. Just the name on the exterior of the chassis, whatever name it had once carried, had presumably worn away in the centuries since anyone who knew it had been alive to read it. The Space Wolves, being what they are, decided to keep it. It took Hellfrost technology to freeze the machine long enough to transport it safely, a form of battlefield cold so intense it could suspend even a berserk dreadnought's systems. They brought it back to the Fang, the great fortress that serves as their home. The Iron Priests studied it. They could not restore what had been lost, but they understood what they had, and in their pragmatic, Fenrisian way they saw value in it anyway. In times of great strife, when the chapter needs the application of pure, is undirected violence against something that requires overwhelming physical force and does not require any tactical sophistication beyond advance and destroy, they thaw Murderfang out, aim it at whatever needs to cease existing, and step back. When the battle is over, they freeze it again immediately before it can turn on anyone who has earned better than that. There is something in the image of Murderfang, frozen in its vault under the Fang, somewhere between unconscious and endlessly straining against its restraints, the remnant of a warrior that nobody alive can name anymore, waiting in the dark for the next time something needs to be killed, that captures something essential about what happens when the systems designed to preserve the self fail completely. The machine persists, as the biological component that generates consciousness persists. The specific person who went into the sarcophagus is gone as thoroughly as if he had died on whatever battlefield first broke his body. More thoroughly, in some ways, because death would have left a name and a record and a specific absence. What Murderfang leaves behind is not absence, but replacement, the shape of a warrior filled with something that is not a warrior. The other wolf and dreadnoughts, the broader category of Space Wolves dreadnoughts, whose Canis helix has activated during stasis, producing the partial transformation that the curse typically produces, represent a middle state that is in some ways more troubling than Murderfang's complete dissolution. They are still coherent, still capable of something resembling communication. It is still capable of coordination with the chapter they serve, still bearing recognizable personality fragments from the warriors they once were. But the mutation has changed them in ways that are visible from outside. The howling that emerges from their voxcasters at moments of high stress, the twitching and spasming of the chassis that no mechanical fault can account for, the replacement of ranged weapons with massive close combat implements by iron priests who understand that what is inside now wants to be close to its enemies when they die. They fight with the fury that the Wolfen curse amplifies and the tactical skill that centuries of warfare have deposited in the mechanical systems, and the combination is, in purely battlefield terms, extraordinarily effective. Whether the warriors inside find it extraordinary is a question the lore does not answer, because asking a Wolfen dreadnought what its inner experience is like is not the kind of conversation that tends to produce coherent responses. The question of honor versus curse. There is a question that sits at the very center of the Dreadnought lore, one that the Warhammer 40,000 universe handles with more intellectual honesty than you might expect from a setting that sometimes gets described as simply being about big soldiers in power armor, hitting aliens with chainsaws. Is becoming a dreadnought an honor? Or is it a curse that has learned to dress in the language of honor, to wear the costume of reverence so convincingly that almost no one notices the difference until they are already sealed inside? But the official answer, the answer that the chapter gives to the dying warrior before the sarcophagus is sealed, the answer that the chaplain recites in the ceremony of interment, the answer that the chapter's records will give to any inquiry about the purpose of the Dreadnought program, is honor. Unambiguously, explicitly, honor. You are being given the chance to serve the Emperor beyond the limits of your mortal body. You are being preserved so that your wisdom and your strength will remain available to your chapter for centuries to come. Your sacrifice has earned you this continuation. Your brothers will revere you. Tech Marines will tend to you with daily devotion. The chapter's future will be shaped by your continued presence, your counsel, your example. To die on this battlefield would be to lose all of this. But to be interred is to transcend the limitation that every mortal being eventually encounters. This is not a lie. Every element of it is factually accurate. Dreadnoughts are revered. Their tech marines do tend to them with devotion. Chapter futures are genuinely shaped by the council of warriors who have seen 1,000 years of war. The honor is real, and yet the lore consistently populates the edges of the Dreadnought experience with details that complicate the clean narrative without contradicting it. The amniotic fluid that is numbingly cold, the memories that dissolve over centuries into abstraction and then into absence, the long stasis periods that are described not as rest, but as an absence. A gap in experience that has none of the restorative quality of sleep and none of the neutral quality of simple non-existence. Was the gradual cooling of emotional life, the way that feeling becomes increasingly functional and decreasingly personal across the centuries. The faces of dead brothers replacing the faces of living ones until a dreadnought who has been in the sarcophagus for 1,000 years has no contemporaries left anywhere in the galaxy, only successors who know it as legend rather than as a person. When the lore's most honest first-person accounts address this directly, and they do, with a careful, measured quality that suggests writers thinking carefully about the territory they are in, they tend to maintain the official framing while adding something beside it, not replacing the honor, not denying the genuine meaning of the continued service, but sitting with the cost alongside the meaning. You're refusing to let the cost disappear into the beautiful language of sacrifice and glory. Bjorn the Fell-Handed does not pretend that everything is fine. This is stated in the lore directly. His bitterness, his sullenness, his intense and specific anger about Russ's departure, his resentment of the ornamentation on his sarcophagus that he never asked for and does not want. These are not presented as failures or malfunctions. They are presented as the appropriate emotional responses of a consciousness that has been carrying an extraordinary weight for an extraordinarily long time. The honor of his service does not require him to be happy about it. The two things coexist in the lore without requiring resolution. The Redemptor Dreadnought's existence introduces a dimension of this question that is harder to look at directly. Whilst the machine was designed, the lore states plainly, by tech priests who gave little thought to the long-term well-being of the pilot, it burns out occupants faster. The surging energies of the machine are genuinely extraordinary on the battlefield and genuinely degrading to the biological component inside over time. A warrior interred in a Redemptor can expect a shorter span of functional Dreadnought existence than a warrior in an older, more conservative pattern. The warrior who accepts this, who goes into the sarcophagus knowing the accelerated timeline, is making a real choice about real trade-offs. And that choice is honored, respected, called by the name of sacrifice. But the question is, who decided that this particular trade-off was acceptable? The Redemptor was designed by people whose primary interest was battlefield performance. But the pilot's experience, the long-term survival of the consciousness inside, was a secondary consideration at best, and an uncounted externality at worst. The warrior who goes into a Redemptor is not making a free choice about acceptable personal sacrifice. The warrior is accepting the conditions that someone else decided to create, with the interests of combat effectiveness taking precedence over the interests of the person being preserved. Both things are called honor. The setting does not tell you which one is more true. It leaves you to notice the gap between them yourself. There is also the question that the ceremony of interment tends to circumvent rather than address directly, which is whether the warrior going into the sarcophagus would make this choice if they were not dying, if the same warrior, a healthy and whole, and with full command of their cognitive faculties and full knowledge of what the Dreadnought experience actually involves, were asked to voluntarily enter the sarcophagus and give up the life they currently have in exchange for the continuation being offered. Would they choose it? The law does not provide a clean answer to this question because it is, by definition, a hypothetical that the actual conditions of interment prevent from ever being tested. What we know is that the warriors who are asked are always in a condition where the alternative to the sarcophagus is death, and that in those conditions most say yes, and that the yes is presented as definitive. What the Dreadnought experience actually offers, at its honest core, is this: the continuation of purpose in a form that allows service to continue, almost at the cost of the specific texture of personal existence that made you who you were, with the degradation of that texture accelerating across time, until what remains may or may not be identifiable as the person who went in, depending on how long the service lasts and how kind the biological and psychic conditions of that service have been. Is this honor? The answer the setting provides is not a simple yes or a simple no. The answer is, it is honor, and it is also more than honor, and the more cannot be fully expressed within the ceremonies and the liturgies designed to describe it, but it is there for anyone who looks carefully at the amniotic fluid and the stasis vault and the slowly dissolving faces of dead brothers. The warrior inside the sarcophagus gave up his body, he gave up his sleep, he gave up his continuous experience of time, but the specific texture of his own memory, the possibility of rest, the company of anyone who knew him before he became what he is now. He gave these things up for a chapter that will outlive him, for an Imperium that will outlive the chapter, for ideals that will outlive the Imperium, probably, if anything survives the various darknesses closing in from every direction. And he is still there, still fighting when called, still answering when asked, still carrying the weight of everything he has seen and everything he has lost, and everything he is expected to remember. In the grim darkness of the far future, that is many things simultaneously. It is remarkable. It is worthy of the reverence it receives. It is also, in its cold and quiet way, a kind of grief. Both things are true. The sarcophagus holds both things. As the chapter's tech marines anoint it with blessed oils every day, murmuring prayers that acknowledge the honor, and somewhere inside the sealed metal, the consciousness that once had a name and a face and the memory of open sky waits for the next battle, and is not entirely sure anymore what it is waiting to return to. Closing reflections. The ghost in the iron. There is one last thing worth sitting with before we end tonight. Something that becomes clear when you pull back from all the individual details and look at the whole picture of what the Dreadnought represents in the setting of the 41st millennium. The Dreadnought is the Imperium's most honest monument to itself. The Imperium of man is an entity that has been in managed decline for 10,000 years. But the technology that once allowed humanity to reach the stars and build extraordinary things has been largely lost. The institutions that were supposed to govern a galactic civilization have calcified. The knowledge that was freely circulated in the Imperium's earlier centuries has been locked away behind religious dogma and factional secrecy, distributed in fragments to specialist groups who guard their pieces jealously and share them reluctantly, if at all. The entire civilization is, in structural terms, running on the savings of an earlier age, spending down an inheritance it no longer knows how to replenish, maintaining forms and structures whose original purpose it has partially forgotten. And the Dreadnought is the literal embodiment of this, an ancient warrior, preserved in a machine that is itself ancient, whose knowledge was accumulated in a time when the Imperium was younger and bolder, and the dreams of that era were not yet entirely broken, who is maintained with technologies that become rarer with each passing generation, tended with prayers that substitute for understanding because understanding has been lost. The chapter that venerates its dreadnoughts is doing exactly what the broader Imperium does, with everything it has managed to keep from the past, treating the preservation of what already exists as the highest possible value, because the creation of new things has become too difficult and too uncertain. This gives the Dreadnought a significance that goes beyond individual tragedy or individual glory. When Bjorn the Fell-Handed is woken every 1,000 years and asked to speak of things that no living person in the galaxy remembers, he is not just answering the chapter's questions. He is serving as proof that something from that earlier time survives, that the connection to the heroic age has not been completely severed, that the chain of memory is still, however tenuously, intact. He is the Imperium's insistence that it has not forgotten what it was, even as everything about its structure suggests that it has forgotten almost exactly that. This is a burden as much as a purpose, and the Dreadnought carries it with the essential quality that defines everything about Space Marines. A combination of genuine devotion and absolute stubbornness, the refusal to lay down what needs to be carried simply because carrying it is hard. The warrior inside the sarcophagus gave up everything that most people mean when they say they have a life. He gave these things up for something larger than himself. And whatever that something is, the chapter, the Emperor, humanity itself, the idea that somewhere behind 10,000 years of warfare and loss, there is still something worth preserving, he continues to serve it. Not because the service is comfortable, not because it does not cost him, but because it is his purpose, and because the purpose, however changed and diminished and mechanically filtered it has become over the centuries, is still his. That, in the end, is what a dreadnought is. Not a weapon, not a monument, not a tragedy, a choice, made in the worst possible moment by someone who chose to keep going when they did not have to. As the iron around that choice is cold and ancient and full of the sounds of machinery, but inside it, somewhere beneath the dyschronometria and the fading faces and the numbingly cold fluid, is a person who decided that the fight still mattered enough to stay for. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the slow grinding down of everything that was ever beautiful, that particular stubbornness is, in its own strange and difficult way, the most human thing left. If you found this exploration of Dreadnought lore as absorbing as I found putting it together, drop your thoughts in the comments. There is so much more in this space. Individual dreadnoughts worth entire dedicated videos, the specific novels that explore this territory with remarkable depth and care, and the broader philosophical architecture of what the venerable ancient represents in the 40,000 cosmology. Let me know which dreadnought you find most compelling, whether it is Bjorn, Murderfang, Rylanor, or some deep-cut figure from the Lexicanum that only a certain kind of lore enthusiast has ever sought out. I want to know if slow, quiet, story-first dives into the 40,000 lore are what you come here for. You know what to do with that subscribe button. There are more where this came from, and they are already waiting for you. Until next time.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.